This is Regenerative Skills, the podcast helping you to learn the skills and solutions to create an abundant and connected future. I'm your host, Oliver Gaucher. New Society Publishers is your gateway to a regenerative future. They're not just about books, they're about transforming lives and communities through the power of knowledge and action. Their mission is simple: to inspire and empower individuals to create a more just, sustainable, and compassionate world. They envision a future where every person has the tools and resources they need to thrive in harmony with nature, where communities are resilient and interconnected, and where equity and justice are fundamental principles guiding our collective journey. If you subscribe right now to their newsletter at newsociety.com, you'll be the first to receive sneak peeks at new content and get discounts on upcoming title releases. You'll even get an exclusive discount code on your first purchase of books, ebooks, or audiobooks. So sign up today at newsociety.com. Hey there, everybody, and welcome to the last panel episode of 2025. As the year draws to a close, I wanted to take a look at what's to come, especially for European regen ag in the coming year. Now, there's no way around it. Governance of the agricultural industry has a massive impact on how farms and the agrifood system are managed. Things like policy, regulations, and incentives, they're all driven by many forces and many different stakeholders. Yet the political machine is really slow and heavily influenced by financial interests. And so where does this leave farmers themselves? And most notably, farmers who strive to steward their land and their ecosystems in ways that policy hasn't caught up to, or in some cases, doesn't even allow. In this panel, we're going to explore these and many more questions with speakers who are closely connected not only to the political side of the discussion, but the growers and the land stewards that are affected. So let's jump right into the discussion to find out if there's hope for positive change and better incentives, or will those committed to advancing regenerative agriculture continue to swim against the current in the coming year? Well, welcome back, everybody. Great to see many familiar faces and new names on this last edition of the panel series from Climate Farmers for this year. Although we've got a whole schedule lined up for next year, we're going to be wrapping up today with an exploration of policy, advocacy, and the future of regenerative farming in Europe from, well, our panelists who will introduce themselves shortly. And to give you some context, so this is the series that we've been running for a couple of years now, where we explore the topics and the interests, especially of the farmers in our community. There are lively discussions there. If any of you are active farmers in Europe, we would love to have you on board in our community, where we're constantly coming up with new support mechanisms and resources specifically for farmers in their transition to regenerative agriculture. And so let's get this conversation started today by going through some simple introductions to get to know our panelists. And let's start with Adele. Could you tell us about the work that you do? And we'll go into more details after we go through the intros.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here. Great fan of all the work Climate Farmers do. I am Adele. I'm based in Wales, here in the UK, where I live and farm. I am at the moment working as an independent food and farming consultant. Until very recently, I was executive director of an organization called the Sustainable Food Trust. So in a transition time at the moment, but really enjoying having a chance to work more closely with some different organizations and learn about regenerative agriculture in other places. So very glad to be here.
Marvelous. Thank you, Adele. Let's go to Tamara.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for having me. Likewise, I'm a big Climate Farmers fan. And there's quite a few people on this call who I think I've met before as well and had some brilliant conversations with. I'm Tamara Giltzoff. I wear a number of different hats, but a very important hat to me that I wear is an organization called Soil Association Exchange, who I continue to work with and have for about the last 2.5 years. I have just helped the business to launch into Spain. Exchange works with farmers to do baseline studying on farm and then advisory to help the farm transition, and then supports the farmer to access financing. And last year, I did a very interesting piece of work with Exchange called Banking for Change, where we explored the financial barriers to transition for farmers, I traveled all over the country, sat in the kitchen of farmers all over the country, and then followed up with a an online survey to unpack financial barriers. And the report and the roundtable with all the banks has led to 3 of our banks launching transition facilities. So we're feeling quite pleased about that. But there is much more work to do. And I am very interested in financial barriers to transition within whole regions, within places. So the landscape transition challenge, but also the agri-food and fiber value chain and the transformation that needs to happen there. So I'm also working on something called the Place Finance Lab with an organization called Climate Kick, who's a seed funder of the lab. So that's probably enough for me from now. I'm in Somerset in the southwest of England. It's very green and wet until this summer when we had a terrible drought, but there's plenty of rain now. Yeah, that's me.
Marvelous. Thank you, Tamara. And let's go to Simon.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for having me. And I can go into the line of the two other wonderful panelists. We have also been very privileged at ERA of growing from and with climate farmers. So thank you for all the work you guys are doing, and also you, Oliver. I'm Simon. I have the humbling honor for the last 3 years of weaving and coordinating with a whole diversity of regenerating farmers from all over Europe, the European Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture, where in the last 2 years we have been so far mainly focused on research, producing systematic empirics of regenerating farmers and their results, together with policy advocacy, mainly for the common agricultural policy in Europe, now also working more on solutions, financial instruments, and so forth.
Well, I think you're a good person to start us off, because though the UK is closely matched with what's happening on a policy level here in Europe, and obviously there's a lot of crossover with the work of the other two, you're also intimately connected from the work at ERA in how policy, especially at the EU level, affects the actual actions and options that farmers have to make management decisions on their land. So can you give us an overview, or at least your opinion, on the power that policy and bureaucracy has in Europe to shape the way that farmers operate, and how the food system at large is capable of changing, or can be facilitated in its natural switch towards different directions?
Yeah, that's a great big question. I can try to line it out. I'll also share that hopefully today I'll learn a lot from the colleagues from England, because I think they have been freed of this policy behemoth that we have in Brussels over the last years. And I think some interesting stuff is developing from which we here in Europe can learn a lot. So far, of course, since the founding of the European Union, I mean, the second policy, the most defining policy of our European Union has been the common agricultural policy. And until today, it remains the largest part of the budget, and now we'll see how it goes forward. But I think apart from the subsidies, which super broadly one can say is something around $350 per hectare, when we have an average revenue of $2,000 to $3,000 per hectare, is one part. But then, of course, regulations is another huge part, which we often don't talk about. And there we have a lot of regulations which are impeding regenerating journeys. So, for example, now with the African swine flu, again, what is coming out of that in terms of animal safety regulations is mostly making it more difficult for smallholder or free-ranging pig producers, pasture-raised pigs, to produce in the way they want and we all want. So I think there's a big power impact on the food system. Then, of course, other stuff like antitrust law, which impacts the terms of trades of farmers. So we can go into the details, of course. I don't know if we are getting there later, but now with the common agricultural policy, it looks like it's shifting a little bit, that more agency is flowing to the member states in terms of the design of the common agricultural policy, but this has now also been revoked by the parliament. So it is to see how the next draft will look like.
Yeah, this is such a dynamic time as some of these stalwarts of common agricultural policy are being disputed, and whether or not the budget that has been allocated to them in the past is going to be handled at the European level, is going to be divvied up to the nation states. It's a very interesting time to be talking about this. Let's go back to Tamara. Can you give us some perspective from the many projects that you were involved in how regulation and policy shape some of the decisions for you as well as for the growers that you work with?
Yeah, there's two quite different answers to that. So there's the grower level for sure, through Soil Association Exchange, and then there's a kind of macro lens, and I can talk at both. So we have something called in the UK environmental land management, which is the kind of umbrella term for a number of subsidies, policies that replaced the common agriculture policy. And the one that's sort of the most easily accessible to farmers is the SFI. I always get it wrong because I'm dyslexic, so acronyms are terrible. Sustainable Farming Incentive. I always say Sustainable Financing Incentive, Farming Incentive, that pays for land management practices and biodiversity outcomes. I think it's been really well designed. It's quite detailed. I'm not an expert on it, but it has been well designed. Our challenge is our UK balance sheet. So we, like a lot of countries, are struggling with a serious amount of debt of our own, and therefore budgets are being cut. And so, what is set out as a really good program has its limits. And they had to put a stop on the SFI program at some point last year or maybe it was earlier this year, because it was so popular. Having not been that popular originally, it then got incredibly popular. So there are some very novel policies. There's also the landscape recovery, which is for funding for larger scale nature recovery. So what's been quite successful in the UK, which did actually stem from a policy initiative originally, is my understanding, is the concept of farmer clusters. So that's groups of farmers coming together to commit to environmental outcomes on farm, often quite ambitiously and very well organized. So sometimes up to 160 or 180 farmers. Typically, the ones that are working really well are in areas that are quite well connected to urban wealth, ultimately, and quite well sort of socially connected. And somebody at the helm of the cluster that's very good at organizing the cluster and therefore applying for landscape recovery, funding, and even institutional investment, or using government money to then apply for institutional investment, as well as going to the utilities like the water utilities and rail infrastructure utilities that may well sit on these large swathes of farmer cluster land. So I think the farmer cluster model and the original funding for that, and how you can mobilize large groups of farmers, is a really positive outcome from some of the policies in the UK. At a more macro level, and this is more my reflection, we are still not building the agri-food and fiber system into our industrial strategy. So we're not thinking about regional economic, we're not thinking about agri-food and fiber as core to regional economic development. It's still seen as a cost and a burden. And then there's separately a discussion around the food system and the cost of the food system on poor health and our NHS system, but they're not joined up yet. And so I would like to see much more thinking at macro, and hence the connection to the place-based financing lab. I'd like to see much more of a connection between our food system, our health, the fiber that we can produce to create the economies that we are committed to, not least building lots of housing, joined up at a regional level. And there's a lot of incredible work going on the ground in the food system and within farmers that should be playing into a larger industrial strategy. So I'll stop there. That's really my perspective, the second piece.
That's a brilliant overview, and I really look forward to coming back and exploring some of those aspects in more detail. But let's go to Adele. Give us your perspective on, the different initiatives that you're working on, but also your work as a farmer, about how policy and advocacy, bureaucracy, I guess, in your case, helps or hinders the different decisions that you have to make.
Hugely is the short answer. And I should clarify that I'm very much a part-time farmer. As you can tell, I spend quite a lot of time sitting behind my computer My partner Will and his family do all the very hard work. I help out on the side, but it's brilliant. I absolutely love it, and I love mixing my sort of advocacy work with practical farming. It's a huge sort of honor, really, to be able to do that. But no, policy really impacts decisions that we make on the farm. It's been a really tricky few years here. It's hard to believe that the dreaded Brexit was 9.5 years ago, almost, and yet many farms still are not entered into the new schemes, and even the ones that are very on the ball. It's just started this year, really.
Wow.
So it's been slow going, and that uncertainty over the last 9 years has been incredibly hard for planning, particularly as things like the regenerative agriculture movement, quote unquote, are starting to build, and you might have farmers who are thinking, oh, maybe I'll try some of that, or a new generation of farmers that are coming through and thinking a little differently about how we produce our food, fibre and other things. But actually, without that certainty from government about where the policy and where the policy is going, where the money will come from, it's really hard to then start thinking about changing your business. So I'd say the kind of lack of clarity and sort of lack of trust in the government, and I think that's very much playing out here in the same way it's playing out in Europe with the various protests that have gone on. And the protests, I think, in each case have been about something slightly different. But I think the underlying cause, I would say, is that farmers feel undervalued by society and by government, and certainly in this country by government at the moment. So it's trying to think about how, my work is, how do we accelerate the regenerative agriculture transition in various ways, through finance, through policy, through procurement, through measuring sustainability, whatever it may be. But really, governments and policy sets the bedrock for the direction of travel. And at the moment, with that, so it's a little more clear now, but I'd say it's still very much up in the air. It's definitely hindered the regenerative agriculture transition. I feel like there's so much energy there, and we see it at events like Groundswell. But actually, when it comes to practically implementing that on the ground, I hope now that the policy is a little bit more set and can be very much improved in some places, but I hope it will allow more farmers to start thinking about innovating. And then, of course, the private sector coming through is an incredibly important part, which I imagine we'll get to later. But no, it's a moving feast. I think Simon was kind to say we were freed of the Common Agricultural Policy. I think it was probably more of a curse than a blessing. So we'll see how it plays out.
So I'm curious, as a follow-up here, where you see the biggest hurdles coming from, because here in Europe, there's always the conversation about, oh, this is an obstacle at the European level, or this is being administered and implemented more on a local level. Is there much of a disconnect in the UK or in other places that you've seen where you have to communicate and navigate many different layers of overlapping jurisdictions that just make it a nightmare to figure out who you have to answer to and which regulations or restrictions you actually have to follow?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're probably much more broken up in the UK with our policy than many parts of Europe, because although Westminster in London kind of holds the inner core of particularly where Treasury money-based decisions are made, actually the policy is set in each of the 4 devolved nations. So we've got England, Wales, where I am, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And those policies, they are a little different in each place. And I think that's right, because the farming systems are a little different in each of those places. And for example, here in Wales, we have a lot of common land and farmers farming on common land. That requires totally different policy to much of England, even though there are commoners in England as well. So I'm on the border here in Wales. Where I'm sitting now is about 150 metres from the border to England. And we have a lot of farms in our farm cluster that sit across both. That's really hard to deal with when you're having to do half your paperwork to England and half your paperwork to Welsh government. So yes, it is quite difficult. And I liken it to my time working in government a few years ago. I did a year working in DEFRA in London, the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and a year working in Welsh government. And when I was in DEFRA in London, the amount of bureaucracy I had to go through to try and get actually quite a simple policy pushed through, which in the end didn't, because it was more inconvenient to push through a slightly radical idea than it was to kill it. So yeah, I think maybe I had 10, 12 layers of people on top of me, and I wasn't, particularly junior in the department. So it was really difficult. Welsh government was better. It's much smaller. So I think, there was 4 of us in our team developing the Welsh agricultural policy, and there was maybe 2 people above us before you got to speak to the minister. But yeah, the bureaucracy is just mad. And, particularly farmers who don't have computers or, don't really want to be working on apps on their phone to take photos of things to evidence. Like, it's tough. So we've got to help those farmers as well as the ones that are really willing to try new technology and new policies. So it's going to be a bumpy ride over the next few years. But
I think one of the things that is different there, because I've just done this piece of work taking Soil Association Exchange platform into Spain. And so it's been quite eye-opening for me to see the differences and sort of see what it kind of makes you quite grateful what does work well in your own country when you're looking at somebody else. And I was looking at sort of access to funding sources, largely the CAP, through regional and local levels in Spain as it's deployed very locally. And what we have in the UK, and we continue to have across all of our sort of economic services, is a good digital government service. So we have everything quite centralized in a digital system, which is relatively easy. I mean, Adele's experience it sounds like it's not easy, but compared to trying to navigate the CAP, which I had a go at, it actually makes what we have look quite simple, in all honesty, mostly because you can draw on data very centrally, very easily because of the way of our kind of digital services. So it does beg the question that actually really good digital services and sort of usable digital services really come into play when we're talking about access to finance and funding mechanisms across any sector. But, this is the agriculture sector. So, yeah, I will say that it was a striking difference to me. Yeah.
So perhaps you could continue on about where you see the biggest barriers and hurdles in this for farmers and for the enterprises that you're working on. Where's the difficulty? Where are you having the most trouble?
In terms of accessing government funding
and also just navigating all of the restrictions and bureaucracy that you're needing to jump through hurdles for.
Yeah. I mean, I think Adele, as somebody who's actually sat in government helping to design those policies and also applying from them, is probably much better placed to respond to that. I think one thing that Soil Association Exchange has done well is to help just purely through the way that we implement our measurement protocol and then capture the data in our system. That in itself creates a kind of individual bank for farmers to then use that information to apply for and evidence outcomes for funding sources. So I have seen that work quite well. And this is what we're trying to do in Spain, is how do we match the data that we're gathering and the change on the farm happening in Spain, and then match that to funding sources and make that seamless and that process really seamless. So I think that there are things like that, how you capture data and what you ask farmers for, what level of detail you ask farmers for, and what, in the case of Soil Association Exchange, what we ask the farmer to do versus what we'll do with the farmer to get that type of information onto a platform. But I think Adele is probably much better placed to answer that question.
That's all right. And go ahead, Adele.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the answer is different for different farmers and different farming types, I think, because, I mean, thinking very practically here, as I was saying, the digitalization of things like grant applications, verification and reporting, which is hugely important to me, but for some of the farmers I know and talk to, that is a big challenge, really, really big challenge.
Yeah.
And so how we help that kind of community of farmers who are not so tech savvy move is going to be a big thing to get our head around. And I also think the measurement and data stuff is, thank God for platforms like Soil Association Exchange, which are starting to really make it much easier and more accessible for farmers. But I foresee this as being one of the biggest opportunities, but also challenges we face as a farming community. We need that data, and we should have had it a long time ago, to be completely honest, a kind of baseline of farm sustainability. There was a report that came out this week from the Independent Grocery Adjudicator, the IGD, is that what it stands for? Anyway, whatever it stands for, I'm bad at acronyms as well, that suggested that there should be a national baseline of sustainability of UK farms. I wish I 150% agree with, but why didn't we have it 9 years ago? We could have started this a long time ago in a very rustic way. I had a meeting with Michael Gove, who was our Secretary of State for Agriculture and Food back in 2017 when he was first in post, and we had a group of farmers talking about how we measure sustainability on the ground. And we suggested, why don't receipt of the basic payment, and through the transition of the cap for the period of the transition, be conditional on collecting some really, really simple data on an earthworm count, an infiltration test where you just bang a drain pipe into the soil and measure how long it takes for the water to drain away, like a soil vest test, and then a bird count and a insect count during the summer. Like, these are things that anyone can go and do, or even your kid can go and do them if you want them to. And he basically put the idea to his officials, saying, "What, why don't we do that? Why don't we try and start collecting this really simple data from farms, and then they'll keep receiving their money through the transition." And they just said, "Nah, computer says no," basically. And it just frustrates me so much, because even though that data would be pretty rustic, it would mean we have a really solid baseline of at least 7 years of data on UK farms, and we just don't have any of that. We maybe have a couple of years on some farms now, which it's great. It's starting to happen. But yeah, collecting data is I think super important. We have to start scaling it up, and platforms like SACS will really help with that. But it will be a big headache for farmers. So I foresee that being a pretty big hurdle that we have to get over.
This is really interesting, the topic about the data that can inform better policy. I want to come back to Simon now to give us more of a perspective from continental Europe, or at least the EU zone, in the research that you and your team have done at IATA, as well as the countless conversations and communication you have with farmers in your network. Similar to ourselves, where do you see sort of the biggest hurdles within both European level and member state levels of tying the hands of farmers who are trying to do their best as far as management, as far as decision making? Where are these difficulties mostly coming from?
Yeah, I think Adele said it pretty on the point. It's kind of a scientific and bureaucratic path dependency that has grown its checkboxes and lists, and basically prescribes and demands compliance in terms of subsidy and regulations, and therewith upends the capacity of farmers to act context specifically. And as Adele and Tamara also said, the planning security of the whole construct is completely decisive for farmers to plan on. I mean, we want larger crop rotations, but we at the same time, for example, in the last CAP decided that member states, and then often the regions who ultimately decide them, the eco schemes, so the payments that farmers get for mostly practices so far that they execute can be changed annually. So that is still going in the completely wrong direction. Maybe I can say that we see some hope. I mean, tying something together of what you have touched on before, the different levels which kind of trickle down and then make the complete subsidy and regulation corset that arrives at a farm in a specific place. So, for example, the WTO already prescribes some rules, which then in Europe, in Brussels, the European Union in the CAP interprets, and then gives new rules for the member states, for then again do the more detailed programming. And then in most of the member states, it goes further down to the regional federal governments to then finalize. And, if you look in Germany, we think, oh, everything is decided in Brussels. In terms of the skeleton, somehow everything is decided in Brussels. But then really, the specific eco schemes and a part of, let's say, the spectrum on how much you can spend in what bucket, how the bucket looks on the farm is mostly decided in the federal state. So trying to cross a little bit, what we see now in AMS or SFI or even the farmer clusters, which I think is a super important innovation. If we look back why France today is I think in the data and showing much further innovation than most of European countries. I personally think the UK is catching up in a sense of many other countries in Europe. But they, in 2015, the agricultural minister, which also came from a rural background, he did exactly that. So they had this farmer cluster learning, then even still without this kind of big money coming in for helping them in the farmer with the landscape recovery projects there's now in the UK, just kind of the farmer clusters. And that already kickstart this peer-to-peer knowledge exchange. Because, you, Oliver, know better than anyone else that this is kind of the real capacity of the farmers to engage on their regenerating journey do not stem from prescriptive stuff, but really only from them following their own agency. I wanted to maybe one thing on touching on Adele and Tamas. I think we have, in some senses, I think it's good that we didn't do baselining earlier. Like now in Europe, we talk about the sustainability benchmarking. So that's basically our side of the same narrative. To me, there comes a lot of danger also with it, because it's still driven by the old bureaucrats and the old institutionalized lobbyists of the Conventional Farmer Association paired up with some others. But the whole innovation that we learn in terms of how do we do MRV from a regenerating movement perspective in terms of outcomes, continuous improvement, as little prescriptiveness as possible, it's not there. They just do again the longest checklist of whatever kind of stuff. So I think now we can do much better baselining where I don't know so much about it, but so for example, the Northern Ireland Soil Nutrient Health Scheme, I think it's called, where we do free soil tests for all farmers to keep eligible for getting subsidies. I think that's a societal cost we could all take. It's not so much actually, and now with precision soil mapping and so forth, I also think like Adele, they lined out some of very simple soil tests. I think we can now also do very cost efficiently proper next evolution soil tests, which give the farmers super good knowledge to basically jump the J-curve straight out of the gates if properly supported in terms of chemical soil balancing and having more cost efficiency with fertilizers and so forth. And then maybe the last point before is I think also in our study we did some kind of baselining because we tried to correlate or show correlation between two very simple proxy satellite-based indicator and a whole what we call regenerating full productivity index. So a whole list of results in terms of yields, inputs, ecosystem services, and so forth. And there we can go back 8 years in the satellites and basically see how the fields in their own paleoclimatic context develop relatively and in absolute terms on photosynthesis and soil cover. So we already see some kind of baseline in terms of where we were starting and how they are developing.
Yeah, can you build on that a little bit? Because so we've been talking about the hurdles and the difficulties up until now. I'd love to get your take on the leverage points. And maybe you'll have heard, this will sound very familiar from the conversations that we've all had with farmers, but there are everything from, where they place blame, where all of this difficulty is coming from, all the way to conspiracy theories. Much like you said, it's very easy to throw blame all the way up to the European Union and say most of the decisions are made there, even though many of the details are implemented at more regional levels. There's blame thrown around about where money is influencing and lobbyists make decisions and guide how policy is made. Oftentimes, this is what is pointed to when policy or restrictions make it impossible to manage livestock or crops in the healthiest and most natural way that a farmer might want to do, but they need to jump through hurdles, much like you gave the example of the African swine flu now causing everybody to confine animals, which is absolutely not conducive to their optimal health. But this is not something you can get around at the moment, Who makes these policies and who's benefiting from it, right? Maybe you can give us some insight on where you see the biggest levers in actually changing this at the moment are.
I guess coming back to me, I think in Europe, it's very much a power game. To me, there's also a lot of geopolitics influenced. I mean, and that's not so much conspiracy theory, but political science in a sense. We can go back how the Americans opposed the very first common agricultural policy and where we're at with this today. And then see people influencing and organizations, how we design our agricultural policy and support for farmers. I think this leverage point's also something that Adele and Tamara touched on is this seamlessness, because to me also, we talk about blending or stacking incentives in terms of helping farmers get more money while we are somehow unable to even imagine how we could really change the terms of trades of farmers. So if that's just as an example, in the 70s in Germany, a farmer got about 50% of what people spend on food. Today, it's about 11%. And the concentration, both in retail and in processing mainly, are the most concentrated. It's an oligopoly we have, for example, in Germany and most of Europe. And if we put these more structural, political, economic policies, which you usually don't talk about yet so much, aside, then to me, I think it's really the seamlessness of the data, because then the stacking and blending of whatever kind of money, which from my perspective now can really only come from abating costs, because as we are going into recession and economic, it's getting more difficult, as our colleagues also shared. For example, voluntary carbon markets in the end always need some kind of nice capitalist who is ready to forego on more profits. Now we call it putting nature on the balance sheet, so maybe it can go into as risk abating and so forth. But to me, that's also with the insurances is a big potential, and we are having quite some discussions. I see one very nice example from AXA Climate in France right now, where the farmers of cooperative agree on past margin, and they ensure their transition on that margin. And then some pioneers of this cooperative help the other farmers to transition. And this, I think, is like the farmer clusters or let's say recovery fund. You can then say, okay, here in this village, in this region, we have problems with flood insurances of houses, for example, or even, I think some, but I think that's the most out. Tamara also touched on it, health insurances. If the cost of non-communicable diseases and so forth, if we are able to somehow correlate that or put that in quantitative models so the insurances and the back insurances and so forth can work with it, that's something. And then lastly, I think a part of public subsidy, there's also debt. So in some kind, we have, in Europe, for example, we have 450 billion of farmer debt, another 450 billion of CPG company debt. Basically, all of that debt is as fragile as the supply chains of feeding into those debts. So you could both think about reevaluating the credit scores of those debts if farmers show more resilience or regenerating journey, and then what is already with some interesting examples happening, if that's the Rabobank for in soil in terms of reducing interest rates for farmers if they show positive results. I really think the seamless data integration, and I think, but please, Tamara, I'll share more, because we had a General Assembly last week and our UK farmers were but maybe also because they were in a farmer cluster with a landscape recovery fund fully on the rails. So they were just, oh, amazing. So I think it's great that maybe the data seamlessness must go through the public and the private together, so that the farmer really has as little paperwork as possible while having all his or her headspace to focus on the agronomy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's something that I've heard time and time again from people, especially farmers, that yes, this data, this information is necessary, it's interesting, and they are already swimming in administrative burden and cannot stand to take on more, even if the data itself is valuable. Tamara, same question to you. Where do you see the leverage points in actually influencing and changing policy for the better, or perhaps even transforming it into something that can accelerate the transition we're hoping to see?
Yeah, just to reflect on that last point that Simon made, I think it comes back to this idea of a just transition. So it's often the farmers that are well equipped to either pay for somebody to do the legwork, the difficult work, or are part of a well-organized farmer cluster in the right kind of geographic location somewhere in the UK. And so there are swathes of the country where digital skills are much less, even digital connectivity in rural areas can be poor, and perhaps there isn't the types of skills that you need to lead a commercially astute farmer cluster. So it's not really a just transition. It's a very interesting model, but to do that well, there needs to be some real sort of policy drive around how do you really support in areas where, there aren't people at the helm. There's a farmer cluster by me that's headed up by an ex-army leader. It's like he just knows how to mobilize stuff and raise money. And, there's a huge, huge farmer cluster around here, not where I immediately live. My area here, there's absolutely nothing happening. There's tiny little conventional dairy farms that are just totally overwhelmed, don't sleep. When would they get time to participate in a farmer cluster or organize one? So it's imbalanced. But back to the leverage points, which was your question. I think Simon touched on a few. I think this and it goes back to my point in that DEFRA and farming has for a very long time been seen as sort of separate to economy. And actually what we're learning in this climate impacted world is that farmers are the keystone species of an entire economy, because there is no economy without food in the end. And I think as the rubber hits the road and we start to really experience climate impacts, we had an incredibly dry summer in the UK. We had a drought in areas of the UK that never get drought. And as a consequence, farm business models are really hit this year. And there are all sorts of other knock-on impacts of that I won't go into, because some of them directly relate to farming, some of them relate to other things just because of the cost of feeding animals this year. So yeah, I think this kind of intersection of farming and agriculture, and it always has been core to our economies, but we've just seen it as this other. And DEFRA has been an other department. It hasn't been at the centre of UK policy making. It is becoming more and more so because of the direct connection with health and food and the food crisis that we have in the UK. And we have a very serious crisis of ill health, diet-related ill health. And there are endless good reports and evidence of the cost of that poor health and poor production of food happening in the UK. So there's a sort of food burden. There's an infrastructure burden. So the impact of climate change on our core infrastructure, whether it's water utilities or rail infrastructure or housing that we are planning to build. And there's a financial intersection that relates to that Simon's already talked to in many ways. And then there is also a kind of intersection with social outcomes. What we're talking about is people's livelihoods and rural economies, and economies that we will depend on much more locally when we have another major shock to our food system. And major shocks these days are wars, trade wars, the next COVID, climate impacts, you name it. We're living in a time of kind of existential crisis, and any one of those could really, certainly in the UK, when we are very dependent on importing food. Supposedly we produce 60% of the food that we need, but we don't produce enough vegetables here, as example, enough fruit and vegetables. We can't just live on wheat and dairy. And so, we're quite ill prepared for that in the UK. There is more and more work going on at a local level and a regional level around, somebody's putting their finger up. There's more and more work going on at a regional and local level. So regional governments are producing food strategies to get ready for what I'm just talking about. And there's more and more kind of convening around local nature strategies. Well, we have to have that at local government level, food policies and food strategies, and much more kind of join up across regions in response to this. And I think actually central government needs to recognize the regional work and the importance of the food system to regions, regional resilience, and the region's ability to feed itself longer term as well, I would say. So I'll stop there. But I think, some of those big systemic challenges are going to be real major levers in this system. I mean, I can see a day, and if you listen to people like Henry Dimbleby, who at the height of the COVID crisis were sort of called up, and all of the kind of CEOs of major retailers and food companies in the UK were called up and like, how are we going to feed our country kind of thing. There was no preparedness from a food perspective for COVID to hit in the UK. And that was only 5 years ago. And here we are again, still not prepared. So, I think the increasing discussion around systemic risk and resilience response will be a major driver for, in the end, accepting that farmers and landscapes are key to our survival on this planet. I'll stop there.
No, very good
Quite
point.
passionate about it.
Yeah, thank you. And so Adele, same to you. Can you talk about the levers that you see and the opportunities in this system to start to drive policy in the way that we'd like to see it?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with everything Tamara's just mentioned. So I was thinking of, how can I go down a different avenue? And I think a big opportunity I can still see is to really make sure farming policy incentivizes producing food, fiber, and other commodities in harmony with nature. It's still the case. I mean, I'd say it is better now in the UK than it was, but it is still the case that we fund food production separately to nature conservation. And there are some options available in the new schemes to introduce things like herbal leys, which is great as part of a rotation. But other practices like silvopasture, agroforestry, reduction in the use of chemical inputs are still peripheral, I would say. And, really thinking about how do we produce as much as we efficiently can on the best land, and then save the nice edges for nature. I'd say still the predominant sort of policy model that's used to fund farming. And I think there's a huge opportunity there to really think about which practices and outcomes we can incentivize farmers to work towards, which really put nature back into the heart of everything we do. And so I think that's a huge opportunity to keep working with government. And as much as I, like everyone else, complain about stuff that's going on, I think I definitely take the approach of we must work constructively with what we have, call out what's wrong, but try and make it better, basically. And I think that's what we have to do with the policy to really, I guess, make sure we don't fall into the trap of regenerative light farming, which I think is, we're seeing quite a lot at the moment, and making sure that even if it's a slow transition over time, we're really baking in that authenticity, but also resilience. As Tamara said, climate shocks are a yearly thing now everywhere in the world, I think. And so I think when you bake resilience into the system from the beginning, it's so clear, which farms are serving themselves well for the future. And I think that's a word we need to start using more. So see a big opportunity there.
I want to do a quick speed round now as we're starting to get to the end of my questions, and I'll hand it over to the listeners in a moment. But back to you, Adele. Where do you see hope in the current system? What gives you some optimism despite all of the barriers and the difficulties we've just listed?
I'm actually feeling really hopeful at the moment. And I think one of the things that makes me feel that way is that, when I started working in this world, which, relatively wasn't that long ago, it was 14 years, I was the minority young person at conferences and events, and it really feels like a next generation of leaders is coming through. And that's no disrespect to those that have come before us, because they've really paved the way. And there's some amazing pioneers still out there on the circuit that we must pay homage to. But it really feels like I go to conferences, events, workshops around the world and hang out with my friends, people that are fellow travelers. And I really love that feeling of community that we have. And it just feels like, rather than sending a boring email to someone, I just, give them a ring, because they're, we're all on the same journey together. And it just feels like we're a group of friends in this ecosystem. And that's absolutely lovely. So that gives me so much hope. And I think the same is true for young farmers as well. We're starting to see more and more of them turn up to events that in the past would have been quite stuffy affairs. So in that sense, this sort of new wave of energy is giving me a huge amount of hope.
Marvelous. I'm so glad to hear that. So, Tamara, same to you. What gives you hope in this murky sector that we navigate
gives
in?
me hope. I think there's no time like a crisis to innovate. And I think often these big challenges can lead to really incredible mobilization of things that we just couldn't imagine. And I think I just said on the chat, look to the edges, because there's some incredible work going on the ground, both at a farm level, but also within the food and fiber system. And it's almost like a disease in itself. It pops up in one area and then you see somebody else doing it in another area. So there is huge amounts of hope. I think the thing that policy misses completely in all of this is the cultural shift that is happening and is underway with this shift towards sort of regeneration as a concept. And it's deeply creative, it's deeply cultural. Adele has said, it's very community orientated. It's the kind of antithesis of our capitalist system in many ways. And so who knows where that will get? It's not for everybody the all-in regenerative or agroecological approach, but even touching the sides of it has an impact. And there's a story there, and there's a different dimension and reconnection to the source of food and what food means and what soil, food, gut, brain health does to us as humans. And so I think that just doesn't appear in policy at all, because policymakers think in silos. And so somebody in the kind of health and social departments might be thinking about that. But I think there's something really exciting about that. And food as a dimension of that, the most important dimension, it's our ultimate cultural output, is really one of our tools there. And then the other thing I would just say is people's voice, people's vote, and people's money. So the Food and Farming Countryside Commission in the UK, FFCC, have done some phenomenal work with citizen assemblies, really getting to the bottom of what do people want from their food system. Because the big retailers in our country have for a long time said, you can't tell Brits what to eat, that's called a nanny state. And actually FFCC have done this phenomenal job of capturing what do people really want. And guess what? It turns out that everybody wants access to good, healthy food for themselves and for their children and families. And so that voice coming into policy making is really, really important. And I think we'll see more of that. And then connected to that, we're seeing more and more community-owned, community-financed, co-funded initiatives around market gardens, purchasing of land, new entrant farmers. So this evolution of the financial system around transition of landscapes and access to land is also hugely exciting, and is happening across the board, across many different sectors, but it's also really happening in regenerative agriculture. And it's something that I'm following very closely with my work. So I'll stop there, and I'm going to say goodbye because I'm jumping off the call to go and play drums, which is what I do on a Thursday night. So thank you for having me.
No, Tamara, that is marvelous.
I can't answer any questions. Adele can answer my questions.
We'll follow up with you real soon. Thank you so much for making time to be here, and get out there and enjoy yourself.
Yeah, my samba jams. All right, bye guys.
Take care. So, Simone, back to you, my man. Tell me about where you find hope in all of this, as you are clearly swimming in the deep end of it.
Tamara's listed everything like this. No, I also see hope in, I would personally describe as a co-evolution of our social and ecological regeneration. And I think that's both in the core lessons of pioneering farmer movements, with youth movements, women movements, and we are working, of course, mostly in terms of the farmer movement. And I really think, as can call the next generation of leaders, but also just the next generation of farmers, is really upping the game both in the social capacity and also in the agroecological capacities, because I don't think we see any flattening S-curves in the results of their journeys yet, and I don't think we can even imagine them really coming from a perspective of how long we have degraded this planet and also our social capacities with them. So I think that, yeah, I see hope, because, if you look back into the history when we as people were able to liberate ourselves again from dominations and also from having bad relationships with each other and the earth, was always in co-evolution with the great farmer movement, and I think it's coalescing now again.
Yeah, for sure. That's also where I draw a lot of my optimism too, is the communication between the practitioners themselves and the immense creativity and resilience of people who are doing this work all the time. So let's open it up now to listener questions. I can already see some activity happening in the chat, and I will give priority. Now, before we wrap this up, just remember that these episodes are only the beginning of the learning resources, design and coaching services, in-person courses, and interactive community that are available through Regenerative Skills. The Discord server is our free community where you can connect with other like-minded listeners, exchange ideas, stories, tips, and resources, as well as interact with me directly and quite a few former guests from this show. Our Instagram account @regen_skills is the best place to see the projects that me and the team are working on, both for clients and collaborators, as well as on our own properties. I'll also be announcing the certification courses, workshops, and gatherings that we've got coming up later this year. If you're interested in getting dedicated support for your own project, you can now schedule a free planning session with one of our team members through the request form on our website. You can also find all the links, show notes, and past resources there at regenerativeskills.com. We truly believe that no matter your experience, your knowledge, abilities, resources, or background, you can be a powerful force for regeneration on this planet, and we're here to help you find your path. So as always, remember to keep taking those little steps every day towards a regenerative future, and I'll be right by your side along the way.